Money is a necessary component for any democracy. It enables political participation, representation, and also allows political parties to reach out to their voters. Every time we hear the word money in politics, the obvious impulsive response is to associate it with corruption, but it is not often so. There are various ways corruption can happen. It could be abuse of state resources, tax evasion, embezzlement, fraud, etc. Of course, political finance, which is the process of political parties using money to conduct their activities, can be an entry point for corruption, but it is always not associated with corruption. Like I said, political parties need money to conduct their operations, to conduct their campaigns, to reach out to their voters with their plans and schemes once they're elected. So it's very, very indispensable for the everyday operations of political parties. However, uncontrolled use of money in politics can be detrimental to democracy. It can undermine people's trust in political parties and political institutions, and overall reduce the quality of democracy. As a result, it is important to regulate how political finance is used by parties, by candidates, and also it is very important to have certain checks and balances to make sure that certain groups and societies do not have excessive influence in political activities of parties as well as candidates. So political parties are often funded through two different sources, public and private. Public funding refers to generally state funding that is given to political parties to carry on their operations and most often to run their campaigns. In many countries around the world, public funding is provided to political parties for running their campaigns. In fact, according to International Ideas Political Finance Database, 70% of the countries in the world provide some sort of public funding to political parties. So every time we talk about public funding, there is an obvious two group of thoughts that come into play. There is one group that would talk about the pros of public funding to political parties, and then there'd be another group that would be talking about the cons of public funding. The obvious pro of providing public funding to political parties is that it creates a certain level playing field for all political parties. Whether they are smaller parties or newer parties, everybody has certain money to carry on their operations and run campaigns. Another pro of providing public funding could be it reduces the influence of interest money, that is money given by certain actors to receive benefits from political parties, whether it could be public contracting or whether it could be gaining certain benefits in the system. Then talking about the cons, potential cons of public funding. Voters are often hesitant to support a political party that they don't believe in. So when public funding is provided to political parties, voters often question, why is my tax money going to a political party that I don't believe in or whose ethos I don't agree with? Another con would be the question, when a country is reeling with problems of poverty, health, or education, why should money be channeled to political parties when it could be used for to solving many other social problems? So it is very important as a result to balance the level of public funding together with private funding. And also, of course, because the limited nature of public funding, it is often not enough for political parties to 100% rely on them, and it is then complemented with the use of private funding. Private funding could mean anything between receiving money from supporters of political parties. It could be an individual, a legal entity. It could also mean that political parties are getting some sources of funding through membership fees, or their own sources of income could be from the sale of goods and services or interest income. So private funding is a very legitimate source in many parts of the world, although the first thought that comes to people's mind is once a person gives money to political parties, he or she is expecting a certain gain. But in many jurisdictions, including in the United States, private donations is actually considered part of freedom of expression, which means people should be able to support a political party that they believe in, and that support could be in the form of financial donations. However, it is important to ensure that private funding is not uncontrolled, and that one individual donor or an individual entity does not have excessive influence over political parties. One of the most common ways of controlling private money is through banning certain sources of funding. In many countries around the world, for instance, foreign donations are banned to political parties to make sure that no foreign actor has any influence in the political processes of the country. Another sources that are often banned are anonymous donations. So any donation made to a political party should be from a known source. And also many countries ban donations from corporations with partial government ownership or corporations with government contracts. So this way it can be ensured that the money that is coming to political parties or in the political process is legitimate. Second way in which it can also be regulated is through placing certain limits on the amount of donation that a donor provides to political parties. And there are many countries that do that. How do they determine the amount of donation or the limit of such donation varies from country to country. Some place an absolute figure, whereas some place a number related to the minimum wage of the country. For example, a country could say the maximum donation that a candidate or political party can receive is 10 times the minimum wage in the country, etc. So there are various ways to do that. So as a result, I think when we are designing any kind of legislation, it's important to make sure that we are not criminalizing money, because money, again, I said, is important for functioning of political parties, but also making sure that how the money is being received and how it is being spent is very clearly regulated in the legislations. And finally, my main takeaway from regulations is that regulations are not the end all of everything. Almost all countries in the world have some sort of regulations on political finance, but the question is about the implementation. So it is very important that political parties, first of all, follow the guidelines that are given to them. So they have a big onus of responsibility in terms of complying with what is laid out in the acts and legislations. And at the same time, there has to be processes and institutions that can actually monitor the level of implementation of those regulations. I already talked about regulating private funding, which is making sure that not one donor can have excessive influence over politics and political parties. In addition to regulating private sources, it's also equally important to regulate the amount of money political parties are spending on campaigning, and also the way they are spending it. Why is it important? Often political parties may compete with each other in electoral races, and the best way to compete is through the use of money to showing off their power. By regulating the amount of money political parties are allowed to spend, we can curb that level of behavior of spending races between political parties. Additionally, it also makes sure that political parties or candidates with less money do not get outpaced by those who have excessive money. So spending regulations are equally important. You also asked a question about is there any country that's considered a best practice? I must say that, at least on paper, almost all countries around the world have some sorts of political finance regulations in place. In our political finance database, for instance, we have records of regulations from approximately 180 countries across the globe, and every single country has some regulation. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to these regulations, and unfortunately, there is no one country that has figured out it all, because everybody has some challenges. Maybe somebody is doing very well in terms of regulating of private funding, but they may not be doing very well in terms of oversight. But if I have to name a country that is at least trying to be on the top of political finance challenges, it could be the UK. The UK Electoral Commission has set out very clear guidelines on income sources, on spending. They have a very strong oversight mechanism, and also in general the society allows for a very strong civil society monitoring as well. In different countries, there are different bodies that are responsible for such oversight. In general, electoral management bodies are the principal body who are responsible for overseeing political finance. It could be receiving the reports, evaluating those reports, analyzing the information from those reports, and then also conducting investigations for any sort of misconduct. But in addition to electoral management bodies, in many countries around the world, other institutions such as the auditing agency or a parliamentary body, or even sometimes a specialized agency for political finance, are responsible for oversight. But the question is whether the question is not which agency is responsible for oversight agency. The question that we must be asking for, what is the level of authority that the political finance agency has? So when we talk about effective oversight, we always say that an oversight agency should be independent of any kind of political pressures. It should have the sufficient mandate to oversee political finance regulations. It should have the sufficient financial resources to carry out its functions. It should also have skilled human resources. And finally, it should have the right skill set to monitor political finance reports to make sure that any sorts of violations are investigated and punished. So we have been talking at length about regulating the use of public funding, private funding, or spending. These are all very, very important. But these regulations also need to be complemented by regulations on disclosure, regulations on reporting. It's very important that political parties and candidates are required to submit their financial reports on time. What does that mean? So after every electoral race or after every year, political parties should be required to submit their financial reports, which lays out the ways in which they received money, basically what are the sources of their funding and how much money was received, and also how did they spend that money. It's not sufficient just to say we received a certain amount of money and we spent a certain amount of money, but there should be an itemized reporting mechanisms. Many countries actually require political parties to submit such kind of reports, but the question also is, when are they required to submit those reports? They should be timely and they should be detailed enough. And to add to the mix, I should also mention that it's equally important whether those reports are available publicly. So no matter how many times or how detailed the reports are, the full scale of transparency is not achieved if those reports are not available to the public for scrutiny. There are not many countries around the world that actually require political parties or the oversight agency to disclose the reports by political parties, but it is a trend that is gathering momentum. It is also in line with open government principles. So how can reports be made public to the general people? There are different ways to do it. It could be done through the websites of political parties itself. It could be done through website of the oversight agencies. And oftentimes, which is the current trend right now, these reports are made available through in a printed format through the oversight agency offices, wherein public can go and request for those kind of reports. But true transparency really is when reports are available online in a very, very clear way, and also in a searchable format, which can be downloaded for scrutiny by civil society. Women, young people, and other underrepresented groups in politics face several barriers to enter into politics. It could be cultural, institutional, legal, educational, etc. Now bring financial barriers to the mix. Election campaigns all around the world are getting very expensive. And these underrepresented groups, particularly women and young people, do not have access to that sort of funding to be able to run expensive campaign. As a result, the best way to remove this kind of financial barrier is to give them access to such kind of funding. And one way to do that is through public funding. So in many countries around the world where public funding is available, government tie the public funding to political parties with the level of equality, gender equality that parties have in their party lists or in their executive bodies, or the amount of money they are using for promotion of women or their empowerment or their training, etc. This is called gender-targeted public funding. It is currently being used in approximately 30 countries around the world. It is not so common yet for countries to tie such kind of funding for representation of young people, but it is gaining momentum. A lot of countries are doing research on the ways to improve the representation of women and young people by removing such kind of financial barriers. But I must add that gender-targeted public funding or any sort of targeted funding mechanism is not the end-all of removing representation barriers for women and young people, but they can act as a complement to other measures such as quota mechanisms and other soft mechanisms such as raising awareness among people. Oftentimes, we hear that the voters are not ready to have women or young people into politics. It's also equally important to raise awareness and conduct voter education campaigns on the value of engaging women and young people in politics. And at the same time, they should also be complemented by training within the party ranks, both men and women, on promotion of women into political spheres. Finally, when gender-targeted public funding happens, it should be tied also with the sanction mechanism. So if the party fails to spend a certain amount of their public funding on promotion of women, or if the party fails to put in certain number of women candidates on the list, the portion of public funding should be decreased. And there is a way to do that, which is often called allocation criteria, wherein the funding received by political parties is adjusted based on the number of women that are placed in the party lists or are in their executive committees.